Okay, so this is a quick demonstration of side-size portraiture. A few things about how I'm setting up. I think it's very important. Somebody was looking at the books with me the other day, and we were talking about how historically they tended to set up the portrait model with one light source, and the painter would stand between the light source and the sitter. So basically the reason for this is that there's going to be a good sense of form on this side of the face. It'll be lit up. Then you get a very well-defined Z. Our teacher would call it the Van Dyck Z, because so many of Van Dyck's portraits were painted with this light. So it runs under the eyebrow, down the nose, and under the base of the nose. And basically, if you get that shape right, you're going to start to get a likeness very quickly. And often if you're having trouble with the likeness, you just go back and find that shape and make sure everything is okay there. But the way to get that is to have a relatively high light source, not too high, sort of a 45-degree angle, and the painter stands between the window and the sitter. The next thing is, with the nature of sight size, basically you end up doing stuff that's exactly the same size as it is in life on your canvas. So it's a great system for working fast. Basically, I'm just flattening this out in my head and copying it to here. Now, to get the size exactly right, basically you can move the canvas a little bit forward. Historically, when they would paint women, they would often move the canvas like this to the tip of the nose so that the woman would be slightly dainty. If you wanted to paint some heroic general, you put it to the back of the head because it would be slightly above life size. Even today, when I've painted children, I'll sometimes move it to the nose. I mean, I rarely ever have it at the back of the head anymore. But so, most of the time though, I try to paint people exactly the size they are, and I'll put the canvas sort of at the front of the ear, and they end up being about exactly life size. The palette is slightly different than what we were using this week. I'm using lead white instead of titanium. The thing about the lead white is it's a very transparent white, and it's easier to mimic the sort of transparent quality of human flesh. I'm using an ivory black, which acts basically as my blue, and then I have yellow ochre, but a good sort of dark, warm yellow ochre, and then I have the vermilion that I showed some of you. This is from Williamsburg, but it's a similar color to some of these historic vermilions.
Vermilion?
Yeah, I'm using that. Yeah, cadmium vermilion from Williamsburg. The Zeki ochre, lead white, and ivory black. So I have my palette back here. I stand at a distance and walk back and forth. My teacher, when he was training us, used to tell us that he thought distance was the secret to being able to get an accurate likeness very quickly and to keep the breadth in the painting. Basically, a lot of times when you look at a painting in a museum or in somebody's house, you're standing at a distance. That's the natural, viewing point. It used to be considered 3 times the diagonal. So a painting like this, ideally you would look at it from this far back. So it makes sense that the painter is also working from a distance. But more so, you're able to get a sense of a broad focus, which is very effective in portraiture. We were talking last night about Velázquez and his, impression that he was able to get with his sitters. And that impression is much easier to get when you're standing at a distance. With portraiture, you have to be very fast and you have to be very accurate. After about half an hour, the client is going to be, peeking around the front of the canvas to see how it's coming, and you don't want it to be a disaster because you start to panic, they start to panic, and it just snowballs. I think side size is fantastic for this. As far as position, you don't want to have the model too high. Like I think right now Tina would be slightly too high. But obviously if you put them too low, they look like they're tiny, sort of struggling to get into the canvas. And I generally try to line one of the eyes up with the center of the canvas. I studied at one of these ateliers where you do, months or, Tina's case, years of cast drawing. And it's a bit like the Karate Kid, that movie where he has them do the wax on and wax off for whatever months, and then he's learned all the karate moves. you do all this boring, repetitive cast drawing, which is basically outline, shadow, line, shadow. And then when you start portraiture, and it's a much more complicated subject, and you're dealing with the complexities of oil paint, so we end up doing the same thing with portrait: outline, line, shadow, and then you start in with the lights. The other thing that's different with this that the rest of the week we've done working on panel. Today I'm working on linen, and the nice thing about working on the linen is that you can scrape down and keep control of your surface if you're working multi-days, but I also find that it helps you with your shapes. So I've been in situations where I'll work for an hour, I'll move shapes around. At the end of the hour, it looks nothing like the sitter. I'll scrape it all off, and because it sort of returns you to an average of all the places the shapes were in that hour, I've had great success with suddenly getting a likeness, and it looks like magic because you just scrape it all off and suddenly it'll look like the sitter again. So I actually had to do that demo in Carmel, and it worked like that too. I was doing a demo in front of 30 people and it was terrible. It looked nothing like Tina. And then I scraped it off and then it looks like her. So
What do you mean by that?
I'll get there. I'll do. So just like with our landscape painting, you tend to want to start with a lot more turpentine here. This is lavender oil, but you want to be able to mass in a bit of the color theory with using this limited palette. The black is your blue. So you basically have blue, red, and yellow. It's just like the chromatic palette. But the black, if you mix it with red, it goes kind of, it's not really purple, but it's sort of brown. If you mix the black with the yellow, it goes kind of green. And if you mix it with the white, it often goes to a very cool gray. So it is, in some senses, your blue. So I tend to start with this black and vermilion. Find a spot, and then
I was told with you.
yeah, and maybe move your hair. So here I'm just kind of spotting where I'm going to put her, where the center of my canvas is. And then with sight size, it's very easy to measure the heights. So the widths are always the hard thing because you have to eyeball them. But with heights, you can actually just measure off of your brush. When the students start, we give them little strings to hold, and they So I was saying outline, shadow, line, shadow. I often work filling in my shapes. The more paint you get down, the quicker, the easier it is to see. So. And as we were talking about with landscape painting, using a black mirror, a welding glass, or in this case, a cell phone, is a fantastic way to check your shapes, especially with sight size, because you can very quickly, your eye struggles to see if things are correct, because it gets sort of used to what you've done. And when you look at them both reversed, it's seeing them for the first time fresh, and it immediately shows you what's wrong with your drawing. As always, it's difficult for me to talk and concentrate, but I can answer questions very easily. So
So you're messy and
Do whatever is best for you.
Yeah, no, but I can, I mean, it doesn't distract me to answer questions. Questions are good. It's just hard for me to come up with things to say. So if I'm skipping something or you don't understand something, feel free to ask.
So you're massing in the dark of the hair before you massing the shadow because the hair's darkest, right?
Yeah. And also, at any point when you need to change the shapes, rather than some artists use turpentine and will change their shapes with the turpentine, I tend to just mix up the skin color rather than waste any time, and I'll push shapes around with the
Your skin color is the white, vermilion.
ochre. Basically, you're almost always using all four colors. There's very few moments when you're going to be. There's very few times when you'll be using just white and ochre, maybe in the highlights, but most of the time you're going to be there'll be a little bit of black in all your flesh color. I was saying to some of you that lots of painters develop a manner, and one of my mannerisms has always been to make the noses too short in the portrait. This one is actually a bit too long, but I tend to overcompensate for it because it's something I'm aware of. I try to get quite large shapes down quickly because the more you get down, the easier it is to see.
When I'm doing the eye, think about the eye socket. just shape?
With site size, it tends to be much more about shapes. It's one of the criticisms of it because we had to study a lot of anatomy, but when we're actually painting, we tend to just look at shapes, flatten it out in our heads. The criticism is that it's a very superficial way of seeing your subject, and I always joke that since I'm from Los Angeles, it comes naturally to me. Sorry.
But you start with the eye and the line. Always.
I was just trying to spot the eye in the center. You tend to start with, since I need to know where the rest of the head is based on the eye, then I wouldn't say I start. It's funny because like if you do those, the guys who do the portraits in the piazzas in Europe, they often start with the eye and then it's all comparative measurements from the eye. They work their way out. In this case, I just spotted the eye because I know I wanted it in the center. But,
That line that you indicated is a line of the rotation axis of the neck.
here,
Yeah.
no, it was just the center of the painting.
The first one is
This is medium, and that's lavender essence, whatever it's called, spike oil. And when you start looking for structure, a lot of people try to grab onto the smile marks in the cheek and this little snot thing. What's it called? The philtrum. I think if you go through a museum and try to look at the historic portraits, you'll almost never see a strong philtrum. Or even if people, Sargent and Van Dyke, they paint these people with huge smiles, and there's no smile lines. I don't think you need them.
The age people.
Hmm?
The age people.
Well, it breaks the form in a way that's really unattractive, and I think it's completely unnecessary. So a lot of contemporary portrait painters put them in, and I cringe every time I see it. One thing you'll always have difficulty with if you do portrait commissions is people complaining about their expressions. Because the fact is, it's boring sitting here, and people tend to get bored looks on their face. When I paint children, I'll sometimes put a laptop on on something where I can get their head looking exactly where I want it. And I think what's interesting about that, though, is that the actual amount of change required to change the expression, the shapes, is so tiny that it's very easy to make a smile. You just raise the corner of the eyes a little bit and the corner of the mouth a tiny bit. So it takes very little to change the expression. But the whole time you're doing the portrait commission, you'll have them complaining about their expression. So just get that to think. I'll do it at the end.
I think it also has to do with the artist, how he communicates with the sitter.
Yeah, that's a lot of portrait commissions, is keeping the sitter.
About the eyes where the model's looking at.
If you have the model look at you, what painters would often do is they would have them look at your earlobe. Rather than say, look at my eye, you would say, look at my earlobe, because then you don't have the distraction of somebody staring in your eyes the whole time you're working.
But don't they usually find a point somewhere to?
Yeah, you have them find a point and look straight ahead until you are working on the eyes. Also, right,
Oh, I see.
I'm always working at this distance for all of this, but when I work on the eyes, I'll actually come to about half the distance, because that's the focus. You always have to watch the highlights. You know, if you over key the highlights too light, it looks like the person is sweating, and you never want to have especially if you're painting a female portrait, you don't want them looking like they're sweating profusely. It's funny, switching from titanium to lead, you know, it's much harder to change the color with the titanium is so powerful. Historically, people would try to keep the mouths quite soft. Maybe because people don't, you know, are often their mouths aren't still like they are when they're posing for a portrait, or because that it tends to be a kind of an awkward shape in a painting. But if you look, especially in a lot of these books, the Sargents and stuff, you'll see they would keep the edges of the lips much softer than other parts of the painting.
Would you recommend your sitters to wear more or less makeup?
It doesn't really. I've never been in a situation where I felt like I could, especially if you're doing a portrait commission, you don't tell the client to wear more or less makeup. I think it would be very difficult to ask them subtly to wear less makeup. But I suppose if you're working with paid models, you know, it's up to you. Yeah, sure.
You generally tend to make the darks a little bigger so you can cut the lights into them. You try to get them accurate.
I think the problem is since I'm spotting stuff, stepping back and checking it, I'm spotting it wrong in a lot of places. So then I kind of build it out and then cut in from the other way, just to, like with the mouth, it was much too big, still is too big, because it was too low. And so now I've pushed it up a bit, but I haven't really cut in from below yet. So. And you can, using a limited palette like this, you have to have every color perfect. That's why this vermilion is so important. And the ochre too. I remember when I was at Cecil Studios, there was one week when suddenly none of us could paint. Like all our paintings were just terrible. And we couldn't get our colors right. And it was so strange because suddenly everybody couldn't paint. And we realized that Zeki had changed their.
Do you have two ochres there?
There's two ochres, but I think they're both. Because I use so much of it, landscape painting, I squeezed out two. Same I do with the whites and sometimes with the ultramarine because I use a lot of it all. So also if one gets dirty, I switch to the other one. I mean, if I'm mixing a bunch of colors, I'll use the dirty one, and if I need a clean ultramarine or a clean ochre, I'll use the clean.
Mark, the red it's on the palette is vermilion. Vermilion.
It's that cadmium vermilion
Cadmium vermilion.
from Williamsburg. Do you need a break?
Maybe some water.
Do you have any water for the model?
Yes. Okay. It's over there. Okay. But you like?
The model would like some water.
Thank you guys.
You don't want to get into the camera.
Water?
Keep the edges sharp.
No, actually, I was about to soften them.
Because in case of repositioning,
Well, I mean, at this stage, it doesn't really matter because everything, I'm also planning on scraping down in a minute. I'll often, when I'm working on portraits like this, I'll scrape down a number of times during the actual portrait, not just at the end of the day. And then I use, here I'm using quite a lot of paint and it's very thick. And like I say, as I'm moving stuff around, when I scrape down, I'll get back to kind of an average of all the things I've done. And scraping the paint off allows me to use a lot of paint now without having to fight it, as I keep working.
do you check at this point whether the left or right, mirror?
Yeah, right now would be a great time to take out the mirror, for example. As you start to get more and more of a likeness, or more and more of a lack of a likeness, depending on how it's going, it's definitely a good idea to keep. So I check both upside down, which is easier to see widths, and then I check just reversed, which is easier to see angles.
Oh, because you are the same distance. I see.
Yeah,
You don't use a mirror behind you.
like this.
Yeah.
I suppose I could, but I just close one eye, use my dominant eye, and then check the two shapes next to each other.
Your director eye is the left. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry,
Do you do butterfly?
what's that? Oh, it's like, I think you were doing that. No?
Superimposing.
Yeah,
It's a tricky one to do though.
Yeah.
no, it was
Can
never.
mislead.
You think so?
Yeah, it can mislead you. If you're not exactly the right height, it can actually.
Oh, yeah, it won't work. Yeah.
So even if you're slightly crunched,
Oh, yeah.
it's gonna change that.
Yeah.
But it's a good one to use at the beginning of the pose.
Yeah. To check the location,
Mm-hmm.
placement. When you do portrait, do you usually work on a white ground?
Yeah, a slightly off-white ground, I think. This is maybe a bit too bright, but we used to make our own grounds and we would put a bit of ochre and a bit of, I think it was umber in there, just to kill the color a bit.
So you don't feel the need to have a darker ground so you can...
No, I don't really trust the imprimaturs all that much. Also, I'm worried it would soak through, you know, when you go to Palazzo Pitti and there's all that Baroque period when they were painting on the red bowl grounds and they've lost all their midtones, you know, to the ground sinking through the paint. Oil paint becomes very transparent over the centuries, so I think using...
So with the red bull, it would risk
Comes.
too warm.
It just kills all the halftones because it's a very dark ground. I think they were trying to imitate because they had been painting on wood, and so they were trying to. A lot of our dark wood palettes come from that sort of period when people were working on the wood palette because it would match the color of their ground. You know, if you're using a white canvas, you're probably better off with a light gray or white palette, but. We all use the wood. I mean, I make these carbon fiber things and then stick wood in them because it's tradition. But okay, so now is a good moment when I would, the shapes are not perfect by any stretch. So I would, at this stage, take my my palette knife. And you need the right shape of palette knife, which is here. So I think the shape of the palette knife is very important. It has round edges down at the corner. I mean, round basically everywhere, because you don't want it to leaving lines in your canvas when you're scraping down. So basically you kind of follow the shapes so that you're not, the problem is if you go like this, you'll drag the white across the black. So try to keep,
Follow your brush strokes.
yeah. And this is, like I said, generally done at the end of the day before you start the next day, and you kind of soften all the edges. And it just means if you have to make any changes, you're not going to be fighting a dry brush stroke that's in the wrong direction or the wrong place coming through from underneath. And you can also get effects that you can't really get. You know, if you soften all of this now, you get this kind of little bumps of the canvas coming through, and then when if you go over with more transparent darks, you get this wonderful feeling of air and transparency that you can't get without scraping down. So there's a lot of effects. It keeps control of your surface. It gets you an average of what you've done, especially if you're using more paint. I've only been painting a little bit, so it's not going to be a huge change here. But
So when you soften with your finger, do you actually soften the edge such that the two adjacent colours will slightly blend?
yeah, it's exactly what you do. And the thing about this is you get these wonderful soft edges that then if I come back tomorrow and I want a sharp edge, it's very easy to sharpen that edge. But if I let it dry, with these sharp edges, it's very difficult to soften them when you come back the next day and it's dry.
So you're scraping, but very, very gentle to scrape.
No, I'm pushing pretty hard, but on the canvas, it just doesn't
Sure. But
I'm okay.
take anything off really. So, and again, if I was scraping, I'm kind of going a bit everywhere and getting dark in the light because I'm going to keep working now. But if I was scraping at the end of the day, I would be more careful.
you scrape uniformly
A
or you
little bit
scrape
that way.
both?
Less. Yeah. There. No, I scrape. I mean, if you have a passage that you think is absolutely perfect, then don't scrape it off. It's some little tricks to expression too. If you raise their eyebrows a bit more, they look more intelligent. If you put the corners of the eyes up, they look happier. this kind of stuff is very useful. I was saying this quote of Gamel where he would say, err on the side of beauty. That's really important in commissioned portraiture, to err on the side, to make it slightly better than real, yeah. People often have a very different idea of what they look like than.
How do you handle that? How do you handle that?
It's not as best you can, but you have to be. You're never going to get it exactly right, anyways. So just get it right in a way that makes them look better. These oil paintings will last a long time, so people will be long gone, and no one's going to remember, anyways. The nice thing about using this, the light at this height, this 45-degree angle, is you're able to get these highlights in the eyes, which really make the sitter look alive. And again, if you're painting the sitter watching you or watching your eye, then the eyes are going to follow the people around the room afterwards. It's, the effect. Some people like that and some people don't. So.
Kind of spooky.
Well, I think it's nice for a commissioned portrait. I think it's good. If you're painting portraits just to paint somebody and then sell them to people who don't know the sitter, then often it's better if they're not following them.
So her eyes should follow you.
No, I'm just saying they will if you have the sitter looking at you when you paint them, then anyone else who looks at the painting, the eyes will follow them around. Yeah.
Right.
So basically, you do the above part of the eye with the eyelid, then the iris, and then definition of the bottom part of the eye is via this accent.
Yeah, again, I mean, I would probably, to do the eye, I would stand about half the distance and work from here. Mine's a bit too big. You want to try to vary to your warms and cools. So right now I'm not using a lot of brushes, but generally the white of the eye, as they call it, is actually always very gray. And it's often a very cool gray. Right now I've kept everything very warm, but at some point you're going to want to go in and start putting, basically mixing black and ochre and black and white to get some grays, and you cut down on the vermilion and look for greens and grays and purples. And this is a bit of cadmium red, the real cadmium red, just for the lipstick. Also, I mean, obviously for clothes and stuff, you would use more than just a limited palette.
Would you usually put a highlight in somewhere?
If you have one, I mean, again, you don't want the lipstick looking too glossy. So you try to, don't stare at, the tip of the nose, for example, tends to be all a halftone here. There's going to be this sort of ochre color halftone around much of the nose with a highlight in the middle. But you want to really downplay that highlight, and the same with the nose. You wouldn't want to, the same with the lips. You want to avoid making them look really shiny. And scraping down is wonderful because it's such a joy to paint into, especially with this medium, to paint into these, after you've scraped down, and you can push especially here where I've...
Cushion effect.
Yeah, well, it kind of softens the edges already. It's a real wonderful, this medium is great for portraiture. Highlights tend to be done with white and ochre. In the same way I was showing you glazing in landscapes, we would often glaze, you might put these highlights in a bit too light, and then afterwards you glaze them with
So you don't want the highlight on the tip of the nose to compete at all with the one in the eye.
well, yeah, and you just want to keep it, you can soften it. Like I say, you don't want it to look sweaty. And careful with the over modeling, like I just over modeled this half tone here in the nose. So I'll then take it lighter. There was this idea we were taught to have the flow of light. So you really try to find the light flowing down the face, and you try to keep from breaking it too much. So, you don't break it with the smile marks. One thing about this studio is there's a bit of light coming through the back window, so it's distracting for me I'm just struggle a bit with this side of the face because it's against this backlit.
Yeah, you would be going for a dark grey backdrop, usually?
I often do portraits in people's houses where I don't have that much choice over my backdrop. In a case like this, it's really just problematic because it's a bright light right next to the side of the face, so it's hard to see exactly
You want to
where.
remove the easel so it blocks the light.
No, because at this point, moving the easel is going to create more.
No, not your easel.
Oh,
The other side.
yeah, it's okay though. I'm almost finished anyways. One thing with the eyes is if you have the eyes sort of looking straight ahead, both of them, it will often make the person look cross-eyed. So what we'll do is we'll often just pull one a tiny bit out, on purpose. So
You don't bother about the crease about.
it's funny, I don't, but depends on your model. Sometimes they're much less obvious. I mean, Tina's are pretty obvious on them. And it was something very important to a lot of great painters, so I feel like it's...
The crease.
There's also this idea of using chroma as value. So like with the nostrils, rather than going really black with the nostril in this area, it sometimes can all be very light. And if you go really dark in the middle of all that light, it becomes a real strong attraction. So what we'll do is we'll use a high chroma red with a lighter value to describe the nostril, even though when you look at it, it's going to be black. But it can be more fun, more interesting it's called using chroma as value, and basically you play with high chroma colors in lieu of actually hitting dark values. So that's a case where the eye, if I paint the eye the way I see it, especially because I'm painting the eye at the half distance. So if I paint the eye the way I see it at half distance, it'll look like she's cross-eyed. So.
That high chroma red is for the interior or the exterior of the nostril?
The interior. Is it raining?
There's wind, I think.
Does anyone have any questions?
The time I tried, it turned me a hard time about another creed, which is the one around the,
The ring of the nostril.
yeah, the wing, yeah.
Where?
That's the one mark.
That's what I was
not to
saying,
put on.
don't put it in, the smile mark.
Is there a reason why you haven't modeled the ear at all yet? The mastic?
No, just because ears are always a nightmare, and I'm trying to get this done quickly. Emma.
Amore, no, no. I can put it on my lap if you want.
It's not happening, dog. You're not kidding. So you want to try to keep your paint surface quite thin. I think a lot of people, especially when they're starting out in oils, they love, even people who have been painting long enough and should know better, they really love their impastos. No impastos. I mean, Rembrandt can do it, but really nobody's done it well since. You can put, you can play with the paint and make it a little bit thicker in the lights, but you don't want to hit these really, so many times it looks like they have a skin disease if you. Those highlights are probably a bit too light, but you can darken them, like I say, later with the glaze, and you'll get a glow to the sort of skin tone.
So you go top down? From the top down?
Let's see.
You look for the highlights.
Well, I'm kind of hopping around everywhere. Oops. Okay. So that's it. If you have any other questions.
Very, very nice. So if you would continue the next day, would you then spit rubbish oils in?
Oil out.
Well,
Yes, definitely.